For years, every family dinner felt like a battle I couldn't win. "You're wasting your life," they'd say, while fawning over my sister's achievements. I stayed quiet, putting in the silent work. But last week, my sister landed her dream job, and she wasn't ready for who her boss would be. By the time she saw my name on her paycheck, the silence in the room was deafening. But before I tell you how my entire family went mute after discovering who I am, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you felt doubted from the people you love most.
What's worse than being doubted by strangers? Being doubted by your own family. Growing up in the suburbs of Maryland, I learned early what it felt like to be invisible, always standing in the shadow of my older sister. She was the star of the family, the gifted one, they'd say, the promising future lawyer who'd bring pride to the Langford family name. And me? Well, I was labeled the underachiever. They didn't say it out loud, but I saw it in their eyes, heard it in every half-hearted, "Maybe you'll find your thing one day." I always felt as if my place was to watch her shine while I sat in the audience. Every family event only seemed to reinforce this. At Thanksgiving, they'd pass around my sister's latest school achievement awards, like trophies, while I sat there unnoticed. Like the time she got the Congressional Award for Early Academic Excellence. My mother proudly printed out her photo and framed it on the living room wall. Me, when I got an award for art in high school, my mother left it in a pile of mail on the kitchen counter until it disappeared completely. I'm not sure she even knew what I'd won it for. That was the story of my life. Whatever I did just didn't measure up. It wasn't just the big moments either. There were dozens, hundreds of tiny ways I was reminded that my achievements carried less weight. When I expressed interest in saving up to buy my first car, my dad chuckled and said, "Better focus on school, sweetheart. You can't get distracted." But when my sister was ready for her first car, they surprised her with a shiny blue Honda parked in the driveway, keys in hand. I told myself it didn't matter. A car was a car, right? But it wasn't about the car. It was about what the car stood for. Belief. They believed in her future, enough to invest in it. Belief was what I wanted. But looking back now, I don't think they ever thought I'd amount to much of anything. It became worse the older we got. I saw how they celebrated her college acceptances, showering her with congratulations cards and dinner parties for every milestone. Meanwhile, my decision to take a non-traditional route and attend community college barely got a passing nod. 4 years isn't for everyone, my dad told me once over dinner, while my sister talked about her law school dreams. And there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you end up stable. Stable. That word stung more than almost anything he could have said. Not successful, not fulfilled, just stable. To them, that was all I could be. Even the way they spoke to me was different. With my sister, they'd ask questions like, "What's your plan after graduation?" and "What's next for your career?" With me, it always felt uncomfortably vague. "How are things going?" or "Any news on anything?" It seemed like they were waiting to hear I'd failed at whatever I was trying to do at the time, so they could swoop in with an "I told you so." But the tension grew most during holidays, the moments that were supposed to bring the family together. Every Christmas, I knew what to expect. With the whole extended family gathered, my parents would gush proudly about my sister's accomplishments. They'd always say something to underline how exceptional she was. "Can you believe she's already been invited to shadow a judge over the summer?" And when it was my turn for the spotlight, if it came at all, the tone would shift. Polite smiles, a quick mention of me working somewhere in retail, and then right back to my sister's glowing resume. It's strange how this dynamic seeped into me over time. When you grow up being told, subtly and often, that you're the one falling short, it becomes easy to believe them. Psychologists call it internalized favoritism. Studies have shown that when one sibling is positioned as better in the family, it's not just the less favored sibling who suffers. It affects how they define their worth,
how they make decisions later in life. For years, I doubted myself. Every time I failed, I thought, maybe they were right about me. At one point, long before I'd ever imagined where I'd end up, I truly believed there wasn't much I could do to change things. Maybe I just wasn't the kind of person who impressed people. Maybe I'd always be average. But something about that constant rejection, it didn't break me the way I thought it would. Don't get me wrong, it hurt, and there were nights I cried over it. But what I didn't realize back then was that those feelings were planting a seed. Every moment of being brushed aside, every comment about just finding stability, all of it was forcing me to make a choice. I could either keep defining myself by what they thought, or for the first time, figure out what I thought I should be. And slowly, silently, I started choosing the second option.
My parents once used to say a phrase that stuck with me. Good things happen to those who aren't afraid to speak up when it counts. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd raised me to stay quiet, not to demand space in the conversation. Still, I realized my silence didn't mean I was lesser. It meant I was storing energy for something bigger, something I wasn't ready to put into words just yet. I stayed patient, watching, learning, planning. I worked hard in ways they didn't see, in ways they wouldn't have approved of, even if they had known. I stopped living for applause. One of many moments that crystallized this silent determination was during one of those family dinners when my aunt turned to me with that ever-familiar question. "Are you thinking about going back to school, honey?" I looked over at my sister, who was talking animatedly about her mock trial results, the family hanging on her every word. And for the first time, I didn't feel jealous or upset. I just decided, in that moment, that I wouldn't spend the next decade explaining myself to people who didn't see me. If they didn't believe I was worth more, that was fine, because proving them wrong wasn't the goal. Turning my own belief into a reality was. Still, I knew it wouldn't be simple. For starters, I didn't even know where to begin. What could I do that meant something, at least to me? Truthfully, I didn't have a roadmap at all. But I had an idea I couldn't shake, and once I committed to it, I embraced the realization that succeeding would take more than hard work. To really go after what I wanted, I had to let go of their approval entirely. I had to accept that this journey, this life I was building, wasn't going to earn me standing ovations at Christmas dinners. And that was okay. That shift was subtle at first, but it became a turning point. Suddenly, I was no longer competing with my sister for attention. I wasn't even competing with my family's expectations. Instead, I found myself competing with the self-doubt they had instilled in me for years. And somehow, that was far more motivating. Because the win wouldn't look like applause, but feeling like I'd finally stepped into who I was supposed to be. Looking back now, the push to pave my own path was probably an inevitable outcome of everything I endured. I'd spent years wanting their validation, but what I needed was independence. The kind that didn't come from proving them wrong, but from proving something to myself. I wanted to build something they'd never see coming, more for the sake of my own peace than for revenge. Sure, the idea of one day surprising them with my success was a thought I kept like a little ember in my mind, but oddly enough, it never drove me. It was a quiet determination, the kind that burns slowly but never fades away. By the time I realized I was ready to throw myself into the unknown, I discovered something surprising. I wasn't scared anymore. I had been through years of rejection, far more painful than any external failure I might face. Telling yourself to create your own version of success feels scary, until you realize it can't possibly be scarier than spending your life waiting for permission to feel worthy. I made my choice.
I would start fresh. And proving them wrong would take more than hard work. It would take patience. They thought I was failing, but they never asked what I was building. Walking away from my family wasn't some grand decision made in the heat of anger. It happened gradually, almost silently, over the course of years. One day, I just stopped answering their questions about my plans. I got tired of giving answers that were met with disapproval or worse, condescending advice. So I packed what little I had and left, determined to carve out something for myself. Without their expectations hanging over me, I felt a sense of freedom. But that freedom came at a price. Starting fresh sounds romantic when you hear about it in movies. In reality, it's exhausting. I had no roadmap, no safety net, and no one to catch me if I tripped. My first stop was a tiny studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. Calling it tiny might actually be generous. The walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors argue about their grocery list, and the only heat came from a space heater someone had left behind. But it was mine, and for the first time, I didn't have to live under anyone else's shadow, at least not physically. The hardest part of leaving wasn't the loneliness. It was the fear that maybe my family had been right. There were nights when every doubt they'd planted in me came roaring back. Was I foolish to think I could do this on my own? Did I even have what it took? I'd sit there eating my dollar store ramen, wondering if their version of me, the underachiever, was who I really was. It wasn't long before self-doubt started sinking in like an unwelcome roommate. But I knew that going back wasn't an option. Pride and stubbornness wouldn't let me. I took on 2 jobs almost immediately. During the day, I worked at a call center, answering phones for endless hours with a forced smile in my voice. At night, I cleaned offices, something I never told anyone about because I could already hear my family's reactions in my head. "Is that really what you left for?" they'd ask, shaking their heads. But those menial, exhausting jobs gave me something my family never could: control. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I wasn't trying to impress anyone because there was no one left to impress. The schedule was brutal, though. I'd leave my apartment at 5 in the morning and come back close to midnight. Sleep wasn't something I had much time for. And when I did sleep, I often woke up in a panic, wondering how long I could stretch the little money I was earning. Some nights, I'd stare at the ceiling and think about what my life could have been if I'd just taken the safe route, like my family wanted. Maybe I would have been at one of those family dinners, smiling politely as my sister bragged, instead of scrubbing floors in silence. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself that safe wasn't the same as happy. Safe hadn't gotten me anywhere before, and I didn't believe it ever would. Night classes were my next big commitment. If my family thought community college was beneath them, they would have laughed out loud if they knew I was pursuing a few business certificates instead of a degree. Sitting in those classrooms after 15-hour days sometimes felt impossible, but it also gave me a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in years. Back then, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted more. I figured if I kept showing up, the more would find me eventually. I wasn't just battling deadlines and exhaustion. I was battling the memories of everyone who doubted me. Resilience is a strange thing, though. Studies show that people who face adversity often develop a deeper capacity for grit. When everything external is working against you, your sense of internal drive becomes stronger. And while I didn't feel resilient most days, I realized later that those struggles were laying a foundation I couldn't yet see. Every struggle was turning into something more, whether I knew it or not. One of the things I learned about myself during that time was how resourceful I could be. On weekends, I'd pick up gig work online, anything from typing documents to reviewing website designs. It didn't pay much, but it taught me skills I didn't even know I could use. I started to understand how businesses worked behind the scenes, and I couldn't get enough. I'd spend hours reading forums and business blogs, taking notes as if my life depended on it. Every new piece of information felt like a small step closer to a future no one else could picture for me. These were the things my family never saw. To them, I was just treading water, barely staying afloat. What they didn't know was that I was slowly building a boat. The first real breakthrough came almost by accident. One of the websites I'd done freelance work for reached out asking if I'd be interested in a permanent position. It wasn't much, a marketing assistant role for a startup that no one had ever heard of. But to me, it felt like someone had handed me a lifeline. The office was in a shared workspace where every desk held someone trying to turn their dreams into something tangible. Being in that environment lit a spark I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't care where I'd come from or what my family thought of me. All that mattered was what I could bring to the table. It didn't take long for me to realize that I had a knack for spotting problems and solving them quickly. The startup's founder, a woman barely older than me, took notice and began trusting me with bigger projects. I wasn't just contributing to the company's growth. I was shaping it. When we landed our first major client, I stayed in the office until 3 a.m, putting together a proposal they later said was the best they'd ever seen. It felt like a small victory, but it was a start. Even with that first quote-unquote win, I didn't tell my family. There was no point in sharing something they wouldn't understand. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. My mom would nod politely, pretending to care, while my dad made a comment about how unstable startups can be. By then, their opinions didn't hit me as hard as they used to, but that didn't mean I was ready to let them back into my life. I preferred the silence. What surprised me most during those years was how much I learned to enjoy the quiet victories. My sister had always been about the spotlight, walking across stages, collecting awards, hearing applause. But my achievements, they weren't loud. They were steady, small, and mine. Like the day I got my first real paycheck from the startup, just enough to replace my old, cracked laptop. Or the time I used my freelance savings to buy a proper coat for winter after months of layering 3 sweaters just to stay warm. These moments weren't glamorous, but they were proof to myself that I was capable. That was all I needed. Looking back now, I understand why resilience mattered so much. Studies often highlight how grit, the ability to keep pushing through adversity, is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success. It wasn't talent or luck that got me through those early struggles. It was the decision to keep moving forward, even when it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every doubt-filled moment was a brick in the foundation I was building. That marketing assistant role eventually turned into a leadership position when the company grew faster than anyone had expected. By the time they asked me to oversee an entire department, I had learned more about operations, branding, and client relations than I ever could have imagined when I first walked through their doors. It wasn't just about having a job anymore. It was about creating something worthwhile. I don't think my family ever put that kind of pressure on my sister. She was expected to succeed, but I was expected to prove myself. And that expectation taught me something valuable: self-reliance. That marketing assistant role eventually turned into a leadership position when the company grew faster than anyone had expected. By the time they asked me to oversee an entire department, I had learned more about operations, branding, and client relations than I ever could have imagined when I first walked through their doors. It wasn't just about having a job anymore. It was about creating something worthwhile. I don't think my family ever put that kind of pressure on me. She was expected to succeed, but I was expected to prove myself. And that expectation taught me something valuable: self-reliance. Oddly enough, even with these milestones, my family stayed hopeless. Maybe they didn't ask because deep down they didn't want to know, or maybe they had already written me off years ago and couldn't admit they were wrong. Either way, their silence didn't bother me the way it used to. By the time I stood in front of my first team as a department head, I realized that their perception of me didn't define what I was becoming. They thought I was struggling because I wasn't showing off. But in truth, I was building something far bigger than they could imagine. I just wasn't ready to share it with them. Not yet. After all, the best things grow in silence until they're too big to ignore. And soon enough, too big to ignore would become my reality.
Sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence. And after a lifetime of being dismissed by my family, I realized the loudest thing I could do was say nothing at all. By the time I started climbing the ranks in my career, I had stopped sharing my life with them altogether. It wasn't out of spite or some desire to make a grand reveal one day. It was more about survival. Every word I shared with them felt like it was being twisted into evidence against me. So, I chose to stop giving them anything to twist. At first, keeping quiet felt unnatural. Growing up, I had always craved their interest. I wanted them to ask questions about my life, to see potential in me the way they did with my sister's endless plans. But every time I had tried opening up as an adult, it ended the same way. Mocking smiles or condescending advice veiled as concern. I'll never forget one particular conversation with my mom. I mentioned I was working late nights on a campaign that I was incredibly proud of, only for her to glance up from her phone and reply, "That's nice, but don't you want a real job someday? Something with stability?" That word again. Stability. She said it as if my hard work was just a placeholder, something I was doing until I grew up and got serious, something real. I didn't argue. What was the point? From that moment on, I learned to keep my progress to myself. It wasn't that I was ashamed of what I was building. I was proud of it. But I'd spent too many years measuring myself against their approval, and I couldn't keep doing it. If they refused to see the value in what I was doing, then I needed to stop needing them to see it. It felt strange at first, coming home from a grueling day managing tight deadlines and complex problems, only to sit through phone calls where they talked about my sister as if she were carrying the family name on her back. My father loved to remind me, "Your sister is really making us proud. She's just so driven. You should take a page out of her book. Maybe law school wouldn't be such a bad idea for you." Meanwhile, there I was, shaping strategies for a growing company, staying up late to research market trends, and landing clients who relied on my ability to make their brand shine. None of that mattered, though. As far as they were concerned, that wasn't real success. I remember once during a family dinner, my uncle turned to me with a smirk and said, "So, what is it you're doing these days? Are you still, doing something online?" It wasn't a real question. It was bait. He wanted to hear me stumble over some answer vague enough for him to tear apart with one glib remark. So I answered with a simple yes. He laughed like I had just proven his point for him. The reality behind that something online, of course, was that I had just been promoted to oversee multiple teams. At that point, I was leading meetings with high-level executives and mentoring associates, all while quietly thinking up solutions to bring more business to the company. But why tell them all that?
To what end? It wouldn't change how they viewed me. Their version of me was stuck in place, a failure with no real direction, just floating from one meaningless thing to the next. While they laughed over the supposed lack of my career, I was busy negotiating contracts worth more than what they'd probably ever dreamed of. But instead of being angry at their comments, I found myself weirdly grateful for them. They gave me fuel. It wasn't flashy or loud, but it was steady. Each dismissive comment was like another brick in the fortress I was building. It wasn't meant for them, but in a twisted way, they had helped pour its foundation.
What surprised me the most during that time was how much I came to value working under the radar. Silence, I learned, was powerful. Studies about invisible labor had shown that much of women's work, whether it's emotional support, caregiving, or professional contributions, often goes unnoticed. But here's what those studies don't always highlight. Sometimes that invisibility can be a secret weapon. I wasn't sharing my progress with my family, sure, but I was also careful not to brag at work. I didn't need applause in the office to know I was making an impact. I was doing the kind of work that speaks for itself. And the irony of it all? I had spent my childhood hating how they ignored me, but now it allowed me the space to grow without interruption. What they didn't understand, and what many people don't, is that success doesn't always look the way you expect it to. It's not always flashy. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's all the things no one sees. The late nights, the extra hours spent solving problems others didn't know existed. It's invisible until one day it isn't. I still think about one particular Thanksgiving when my father stopped mid-conversation to ask casually, "Are you ever going to go back to school? You're smart. You could have been anything, you know." I wanted to laugh. Could have been anything? The truth was, by that point, I was running circles around people with advanced degrees. School wasn't the reason I had been overlooked. It was their inability to see me for who I had become that held them back. But instead of replying, I swallowed my words. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I didn't feel the need to say it. By then, I'd learned to redirect my energy.
Every time someone questioned me or insulted what they thought I was doing, I poured that frustration into my work. Instead of fighting for recognition from people who clearly had no interest in giving it, I fought for my own respect. Looking back now, that was the turning point. The house I had always tried to build with their approval in mind just didn't matter anymore. And while I stayed quiet, while I let them continue assuming I was lost, I grew. I learned how to run financial forecasts. I managed people twice my age. I negotiated deals that scared me because they were so massive. I didn't do it for their validation, and that's what made all the difference. Inside, something shifted. I didn't need their approval. I needed my own. There was just one problem. I carried a small knot of fear that sooner or later they'd figure it out, and somehow they'd take it away from me. Years of being dismissed made me cautious almost to a fault. I wasn't flashy about my new role as a director. I didn't make public announcements about the accounts I was landing. Success for me came in increments, not the bigger, louder moments my sister's career seemed to revolve around. But I didn't mind. What mattered was that this success felt real. It belonged to me.
And there's something strange about silence. It builds tension. The longer I kept my career hidden from them, the more I realized how much power it gave me. Every promotion I earned felt like a private victory no one could diminish. And the more I accomplished, the less I cared about what my family thought. I wasn't bitter exactly. By then, it felt less about proving them wrong and more about proving myself right. They didn't believe in me, that was true. But their doubts had slowly become irrelevant. What they didn't know was that my silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was my greatest advantage. They had no idea how much I had grown or how far I had come. And the longer that remained the case, the more it worked in my favor. Because while they sat around the dinner table, trading stories about my sister's latest wins, I was planning my next big move. And it wasn't a matter of if they'd find out, but when.
Little did they know, the tables were about to turn.
They thought I was stuck, but I was climbing higher than they could imagine. I still remember sitting in that tiny studio apartment, reviewing marketing strategies late into the night, wondering if anyone truly noticed the work I was putting in. My family certainly didn't. As far as they were concerned, I'd faded into obscurity the moment I chose to leave. They had no idea that each day I walked into work, I was taking one step closer to a place they never thought I'd reach. But it wasn't easy. Nothing about it was. The climb was slow, grueling, and came with sacrifices I never could have imagined when I first set out on this path. When my boss offered me a junior role leading small-scale projects, it felt like a test. I knew this was one of those moments. Fail this, and I'd sink back into the mediocrity my family always expected from me. Succeed, and I'd finally start proving to myself, not them, that I wasn't what they made me believe I was. So, I said yes to everything. Every challenge thrown my way, every midnight email, every chance to take on more than my title technically called for. I worked twice as hard as some of my peers, partly because I felt like I had to, but mostly because I didn't know any other way to stand out. Hard work wasn't just a habit at that point. It was survival. Looking back, I can see how much I gave up during those years. Vacations were non-existent. While my coworkers jetted off to the coast or took trips abroad, I stayed behind, glued to my desk, meeting deadlines no one else wanted. Birthdays and weekends blurred together. Some nights I woke up at 3 a.m. with my laptop still open on my bed, spreadsheets glowing faintly on the screen. And yet, I didn't mind. It wasn't because I loved the grind. Who does, really? It was because I knew it was building towards something meaningful. My family couldn't see it, and maybe they didn't want to. But I wasn't doing this for them. One example that stands out is when my department faced a potential disaster with a key client. There had been a major hiccup in our deliverables, and someone needed to stay late to problem solve before the client found out. My boss asked the room who could handle it, and the silence that followed felt deafening. I raised my hand. It wasn't because I felt ready. I wasn't. But because I knew someone had to step up. That night I went home with every detail of the client's account memorized. By morning, I had not only fixed the issue, but created a process to prevent it from ever happening again. The client was thrilled, my boss was impressed, and for the first time, I felt like I could actually do this. It wasn't just a job anymore. I was learning how businesses really worked, from the inside out. They thought I was wasting my life. But what they didn't know was that every late night and every extra task was teaching me something important. By the time I was promoted to manage a full team, I knew not just the responsibilities of my role, but everyone else's too. I understood finance, marketing, client relations, all the moving parts that made the company run. At the time, I didn't realize how valuable that knowledge would become, but it stuck with me. Somewhere deep down, an idea was forming, though it wouldn't come to life until much later. Success stories like mine aren't unheard of, though they rarely happen without help. Research has shown that people who succeed against the odds often do so by combining relentless hard work with smart networking. But here's the thing. I wasn't great at networking at first. I didn't have the charm of some of my colleagues, the ones who could walk into a networking event and leave with half the room's business cards. What I did have was persistence. If I couldn't sell myself in a few seconds of small talk, I'd prove my worth when it mattered.
I stayed in touch with clients after projects ended, asking thoughtful questions about what worked for them and what didn't. I built relationships not through favors or flattery, but through results. One client in particular became pivotal in my story. He had seen firsthand how I turned around an underperforming campaign on a shoestring budget and brought in numbers no one thought were possible. He pulled me aside after a presentation one day, handed me his card and said, "If you ever need a bigger opportunity, call me." At the time, I didn't quite understand what he meant, but I kept his card. Turns out it was a small moment that would lead to one of the biggest opportunities of my career. Of course, my family had no idea any of this was happening. To them, I was still the underachiever, barely getting by in some vague marketing role they couldn't be bothered to ask about. One year, my sister mentioned during a family barbecue that she was considering working part-time for a nonprofit to breathe a little while studying for her certifications. My parents praised her for thinking about balance and making time for self-care. Meanwhile, I had quietly worked my way up to leading multiple campaigns, overseeing millions of dollars in client budgets. Balance, for me, was a concept I hadn't thought about in years. But I didn't need it, not then. My focus was elsewhere. There's a strange kind of satisfaction that comes from building something step by step, unnoticed. As I climbed higher in my career, from managing my first project to navigating full-scale client accounts, I started to realize that my silence was insulating me. Without my family watching, I felt freer. They weren't waiting to comment or criticize, and without their constant noise, I could think more clearly about what I wanted. Every promotion brought me closer to that version of myself I had always hoped to become, the version they had always doubted. One of my proudest moments came when I was tasked with presenting a strategy to the executive team. After months of preparation, I spent countless nights rehearsing, perfecting every slide, anticipating every question they might throw at me. When the day came, I walked into that conference room shaking, but as I began to speak, something clicked. I wasn't just reciting a pitch, I was showcasing something I had built from the ground up. And when they approved my plan unanimously, I felt something I'd never had before: respect. Not from them, from myself. That might have been the moment I realized I didn't need their validation after all. Success, however, isn't just about skills or knowledge, it's about grit. Experts often say that resilience, the ability to keep going even when things seem impossible, is what separates those who succeed from those who don't. My story is proof of that. It wasn't because I was better or smarter than anyone else. It was because I didn't stop. The long hours, the sacrifices, the endless doubts I wrestled with, it all boiled down to a simple choice: to keep going no matter what. By the time I had worked my way into an executive role, I was unrecognizable to the person I'd once been. I wasn't unsure of myself anymore, seeking permission or validation. I had built too much, given too much, grown too much to be that same girl sitting silently at holiday dinners, shrinking into the background. But here's the funny part. My family still thought I was barely getting by. To them, I was probably still the one who didn't measure up. Even at that point, they didn't know the first thing about what I was building, and I was okay with that. What I couldn't have planned, though, was what came next. By the time I became CEO, I had worked for nearly a decade without ever once feeling the need to announce it to them. It wasn't spite or secrecy. It just wasn't about them anymore. I'd built an entire company from scratch, from the lessons I'd learned climbing someone else's corporate ladder, and I'd done it all without the support they swore I would need. Those long nights, missed vacations, and quiet sacrifices, they had finally paid off. The company was profitable, growing, and respected in the industry. And still, if you asked my father, he'd probably say, "She's doing something in marketing, I think." But then fate handed me an opportunity I couldn't have written better myself. It started with an email from my HR team, an application from a job seeker gushing about how much they admired our company and how it had always been their dream to work here. I scanned the name at the top of the email and I froze. For the first time in years, I found myself reading her words over and over, my mind spinning. It was my sister. The sister who had always outshone me. The sister they'd loved to praise while I disappeared into the background. And now she wanted to work at the company I built. At that moment, I knew the tables had finally turned.
The same door they shut on me was about to open wide for my sister. It started with a routine email, the kind my HR team handles every day. Another enthusiastic applicant hoping to land a spot at the company I had built. I almost clicked past it, skimming through the dozens of resumes we were processing that week. But something about the name caught my attention. My heart stopped for a moment as I reread it. There it was, clear as day. My sister's name, bold at the top of the page. For a second, I wondered if this was some kind of mistake. But no, her cover letter removed any doubt. She had spent paragraphs gushing about the company, my company, and its stellar reputation in the industry. Her words dripped with admiration for the culture, the accomplishments, the forward-thinking leadership. Words she had probably practiced over and over to sound just perfect. And yet nowhere in those paragraphs was the faintest hint that she knew I was the one behind all of it. She didn't have a clue. I don't think I'd ever felt such a mix of conflicting emotions at once. There was irony, of course, the perfect narrative twist. My sister, whose every success had once overshadowed me, now wanted to work under the very roof I had built. I felt a rush of validation too, knowing she admired the company so much, without realizing how much of myself I had poured into it. But beneath that, there was something else, something heavier. For all the years I had spent carving out a space for myself, I never expected her to step right into it. The first thing I did was read her resume from top to bottom. It was polished, impressive, exactly what you'd expect from someone who had been groomed to succeed from day one. Her tone in the cover letter was confident, almost overly so, as if she were certain this job was practically hers. It brought back memories of all the times she had spoken about one day joining a top-tier company, the kind people respect without question. I could hear her voice even as I read the words. Back then, I would have rolled my eyes and said nothing. But now I was the one deciding if she'd even make it to an interview. Part of me expected resentment to bubble up, but it didn't. What struck me most as I reopened her application was the irony of it all. Her future now hinged on an opportunity I had created, the kind of opportunity that no one in our family would have ever expected from me. And as I sat there staring at her carefully crafted professional history, I realized I had no intention of shutting her out. I wasn't holding a grudge or looking for a way to punish her for the years she had spent taking center stage while I faded into the background. This wasn't about retribution. It was about knowing that I had finally built something they couldn't ignore. Still, I couldn't stop smiling as I thought about one thing. She had no idea. She had no idea that the company culture she admired so much had come to life because of me. She had no idea that the leader she praised in her letter for innovating in the industry was someone she'd probably never even think to associate with. And she certainly had no idea that the job she'd been practicing interview questions for was about to pull her into a situation she could never prepare for. I didn't tell anyone, least of all her. I signed her offer letter myself, a small, quiet decision that felt more surreal the longer I thought about it. This was the same sister who had received the best of everything growing up: attention, resources, belief.
And here I was, holding her next milestone in my hands. The irony wasn't lost on me, but rather than indignation, I felt something closer to fascination. What would happen when she realized whose signature was scrawled at the bottom of her first paycheck? Could she even begin to understand the steps it had taken for me to get here? There's an emotional complexity to moments like these, though. Psychologists say that seeing family members benefit from your hard work can bring out a strange mix of pride and discomfort, especially if those same family members have dismissed you in the past. It's one thing to forgive the people who doubted you. It's another thing entirely to hold the key to their future. And as much as I tried to frame it purely as a professional decision, her qualifications fit the role, and that's what mattered. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the history between us pressing on my chest. It didn't help that she was so vocal with her excitement. The moment she got the job offer, her posts on social media lit up. She shared glowing comments about how proud she was to join the company, about how it aligned so perfectly with her goals. I didn't follow her. I hadn't for years, but mutual friends made sure the updates found their way into my inbox. "Look at her," one email began, with a screenshot attached of her enthusiastic announcement. "She's finally living her dream. Doesn't that feel good?" The truth? I wasn't sure how it felt. Proud, conflicted, distant. Maybe it was all three. While she gushed to anyone who would listen, I stayed silent, watching from the sidelines as my sister walked into a world she had no idea I'd created. At one point, I spotted her chatting in one of our company Slack channels, participating eagerly in discussions she probably assumed the CEO never had time to read. I saw her introduce herself to the team with the same bright confidence our family had always praised her for. And still, she didn't know. I wanted to see her reaction when she finally put the pieces together, not for revenge, but for closure. If this journey had taught me anything, it was that people don't change until their assumptions are forced to. For our entire lives, she had assumed I was less than, less capable, less focused, less worthy of recognition. And now she was starting her dream job under my leadership without even realizing it. At first, I thought I'd wait for her to figure it out on her own, but part of me wondered if she'd even notice. Was it possible that her image of me as the underachieving sibling was so strong that she wouldn't think to connect the dots? I let myself laugh at the absurdity of that thought. Of course she'd figure it out. She'd have to, eventually. Because there was only so long she could avoid seeing my name, and the closer we got to payday, the harder it was to resist counting down the days. Signing her paycheck felt symbolic in a way I couldn't quite put into words. This wasn't about power or proving a point. It was about knowing, finally, that my work had spoken louder than anything I could have ever tried to say. I couldn't wait to see her face when the truth came out, to see her realize that the person she hadn't thought twice about growing up, the sibling she never looked up to, was the one who had signed her offer letter and everything after it. I wondered if she'd cringe at the things she'd said about her big career ambitions, all while unknowingly describing the very business I had painstakingly built, or if she'd even acknowledge the irony. Either way, I knew the moment would be one neither of us would forget, and that moment came sooner than I expected. Sometimes a single piece of paper can rewrite a lifetime of assumptions. Payday arrived, like it always did, a routine moment for everyone else in the office. But for me, it was anything but ordinary. I waited, wondering how long it would take for her to discover the name staring back at her. I imagined all the scenarios in my head, how she'd respond, what she'd think, whether she'd even connect the dots right away. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. I'd stayed late that evening, lingering in my office under the pretense of catching up on paperwork. In truth, I didn't want to miss the moment. I didn't want to miss what it felt like when years of underestimation collided with undeniable fact. I couldn't see her face directly, of course, but I was only a few doors down from the common area where most of the team gathered after hours. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the normal chatter as people grabbed their envelopes and updated their direct deposits. But then it got quiet. Not all at once, but enough to notice. The silence stretched until I knew it could only mean one thing. She'd seen it. That little piece of paper had done what nothing else ever could. I stepped toward the door, just enough to hear as someone asked her if everything was okay. "Yeah," she said, her voice carrying that edge of confusion that told me it wasn't. I don't understand." Her tone was enough to paint the picture in my mind. I could practically see her sitting there, holding the paycheck in both hands, her brow furrowed, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. It wouldn't have been the number on the check. The amount wasn't what had caught her off guard. It was the signature right beneath it. My signature. The name she'd spent a lifetime brushing off, dismissing as if it belonged to someone who would never amount to much. Now, that same name was the one approving her wages.
It didn't take long before she began piecing it together, or trying to. "Is this right?" she asked one of the office managers, who, of course, nodded. Everything was correct, they told her, and there was no mistake. She paused, clearly struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. "But who's the CEO? The signature?" Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, I thought she might say my name out loud. Instead, she shook her head, and the room seemed to wait on her next move. When she found the courage to look again, it wasn't the paycheck she stared at. It was the company logo printed at the top, the name of the organization she had been so proud to join. That realization hit her harder than I think even she expected. The confusion in her voice turned into something closer to disbelief. I could almost hear her thoughts racing as she tried to reconcile the version of me she thought she knew with the person who signed her paycheck. Eventually, the office manager must have realized how awkward the moment was becoming and gently suggested she circle back later if she had questions. But my sister didn't move. She stayed rooted in place, holding that paper as if it might vanish into thin air if she let go. For what felt like an eternity, she stared at my signature, her face going pale as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. There it was, in black and white, a truth she couldn't unsee, one she couldn't laugh off or dismiss. Psychologists say that moments of role reversal within a family can lead to powerful shifts in dynamic. When someone you've always seen as below you suddenly surpasses you, it forces a reevaluation of everything you've ever believed about them and about yourself. In families with long-standing patterns of favoritism, these moments can cause a shock to the system as old hierarchies crumble. For my sister, this wasn't just about a paycheck. It was about years of assumptions unraveling all at once. The silence in the office that evening was thick, like everyone was holding their breath. I stayed in my room, giving her space to process what she'd just learned. But curiosity got the best of me, and eventually I stepped out, acting as if I didn't know anything unusual had happened. She whipped her head around when she saw me, her eyes wide, her expression teetering somewhere between awe and embarrassment. "You," she said slowly, like she wasn't sure if she was accusing me or confirming what she already knew. This is your..." She couldn't even finish the sentence. It's funny how one moment can strip away years of practiced confidence. For as long as I could remember, my sister had always been so sure of herself. She was the golden child, the one with all the right answers, the one who made everything look easy. But standing there, she suddenly seemed small, like the ground beneath her had shifted, and she wasn't sure where to place her feet. "I had no idea," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a vulnerability in her words I'd never heard before, a softness that took me by surprise. How did you do all this?"
I stayed quiet for a moment, watching her grapple with the weight of what was happening. Then, in the calmest voice I could muster, I said, "I worked for it." Her face flushed and she looked down at the paycheck again, as if to avoid meeting my gaze. "I didn't know," she muttered. "I didn't know you all this time." There was something in her voice that almost sounded like regret, but she didn't say the words out loud. Instead, she just stood there, silent, as the realization settled in. I had built something she admired without even knowing it, and now her world was shifting because of it.
Research shows that these kinds of moments where deeply ingrained family perceptions are challenged often lead to a mix of emotions from shock to respect to discomfort. It's like every memory they have of you suddenly rewrites itself in light of new evidence. For her, that piece of paper wasn't just a paycheck. It was proof that the version of me she had always believed in, small, insignificant, forgettable, wasn't real. And there was no going back from what she now knew. The most surprising part, though, was what happened next. After a long pause, she took a deep breath, and when she finally looked at me, her expression wasn't just one of shock, it was one of respect. For the first time in my life, she seemed to see me not as her younger sibling or the underachiever our family had always pitied. She saw me as her equal, or maybe for the first time as someone she could look up to. "You really did it," she said quietly, shaking her head like she still couldn't believe what was unfolding. And in that moment, something shifted between us, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Her expression said enough. What struck me most wasn't her shock, though. It was the fact that just this once, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I didn't need to explain myself or defend my choices. The truth was written in black ink on that paycheck, and for the first time, it spoke louder than anything I could have said. Her shock, as satisfying as it was, turned out to be just the beginning. What came next would ripple beyond that room, shaking the foundations of every assumption our family had ever held about me. Because now that she knew the truth, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the family learned it too. They thought they knew me, but they didn't know the woman I'd become. When my sister saw my name on her paycheck, I knew it wouldn't be long before the rest of the family found out. I didn't plan to tell them. It wasn't some big reveal I'd been waiting for. If anything, I'd avoided sharing the truth for so long because I didn't see the point. But now it was inevitable. My sister couldn't keep something like this to herself, and honestly, I didn't want her to. If they were going to know who I had become, it might as well be now. It started at a family dinner. One of those dinners I used to dread, where sitting at the same table as them felt more like an obligation than a reunion. This time, though, it was different. My sister had insisted that everyone attend, which I already found odd. The moment I arrived, I felt the weight of their eyes on me. They looked at me differently, not with the dismissal I'd grown used to, but with something closer to curiosity. My dad, who usually kept his questions to safe, airy topics, glanced up at me and said, "So, you're CEO now." I didn't even have time to answer before my sister jumped in. "Do you guys know what her company actually does? Because I didn't." She laughed nervously, trying to make light of her own shock, but it was clear she was still processing everything. She started explaining faster than I expected, listing every highlight she could remember from my company's history. Clients we had worked with, awards we'd won, press coverage we had received. She sounded almost proud, which was strange to hear from someone who had never really taken an interest in my life. My mother sat there, wide-eyed, her hand resting on her wine glass like she'd forgotten it was there. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but there was something behind her question, a mix of hurt and confusion. I met her eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. "You never asked," I said simply. I didn't say it to be cruel, just honest. And the second the words left my mouth, my father shifted uncomfortably across the table, his gaze dropping to his plate. The room felt heavy as silence stretched between us. My parents weren't used to this dynamic.
They'd always been the ones asking half-hearted questions and then shifting the conversation back to my sister. Suddenly, that wasn't an option. The spotlight wasn't on her anymore. It was on me. And for once, I didn't feel like grabbing it was a fight. It was a strange reversal, the kind that families like ours aren't built to handle gracefully. My mother opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but nothing came out. For a woman who always seemed to know the right thing to say, she looked lost. My sister broke the tension by adding, she signed my paycheck, Mom. Literally signed it. Her tone was light, joking even, but you could still hear the disbelief underneath. To everyone else at the table, it probably seemed like she was still processing what that signature represented. Years of work they hadn't acknowledged, sacrifices they hadn't seen, success they'd never expected. But to me, it sounded like something else. She wasn't just surprised I'd built something. She was surprised I'd built something bigger than anything they had envisioned for anyone in the family. In her own way, I think she was proud. But that pride carried an undertone of jealousy she didn't quite manage to hide. "Wow," my uncle finally muttered, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't realize you were doing all this." He gestured vaguely, as if he couldn't quite put his finger on what all this actually meant. His words weren't malicious, but they carried that same undertone I'd come to expect. Surprise mixed with a little bit of doubt. Because for all their shock and intrigue, part of them couldn't let go of the version of me they had held onto for years. To them, I'd always been the one struggling to figure life out, the one who couldn't keep up with my sister's picture-perfect track record. And now, even as they sat in front of undeniable proof of my success, you could feel the tension of their old perceptions clashing with reality. Families struggle with these moments of revelation for good reason. As experts point out, when someone defies long-standing expectations, it forces a reckoning with those old perceptions. It exposes biases that have gone unchallenged for years, reshuffling power dynamics they didn't even realize existed. And in our family, where my sister had always been the centerpiece, the one everyone looked to, it created a distinct shift. Every moment they spent asking me questions or marveling at what I'd accomplished was a moment she wasn't holding court like she always had. That tension didn't need to be spoken. It hung in the air like a fog over the dinner table. At one point, my dad finally looked at me, his jaw tight. "You've done well," he said. And even though the words were simple, it was the closest thing to praise I'd ever gotten from him. But for some reason, it didn't hit the way I thought it might. For years, a moment like this would have meant everything to me. I would have done anything to hear those words growing up, to feel like I had finally earned his approval. But sitting there, in that room filled with faces I had grown up trying to impress, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need any of it.
Their questions kept coming. How long had I been running the company? Why hadn't I told them sooner? Why had I kept so much of my life from them? There was genuine curiosity in their voices, sure, but also something heavier, like guilt. Because in asking those questions, I knew they were reflecting on all the years they hadn't asked them before. All the conversations they had skimmed over, assuming my life wasn't interesting enough to care about. That realization wasn't just uncomfortable for them, it was uncomfortable for me too. Their disbelief wasn't just about being surprised by my success. It was about facing the reality of how little they had paid attention. I thought their reactions would bring me closure, but instead, they taught me something more important. That their judgment, their dismissal, had shaped me in ways I hadn't even begun to process. For years, I had carried the weight of their expectations, or lack of them, on my shoulders. It had pushed me to work harder, to carve out a space for myself where their opinions couldn't reach. And now, sitting across from them, I realized I didn't need their approval to feel successful.
For the first time in my life, I looked at my family and felt complete without their permission. My mom finally leaned forward, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You must feel so proud," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. I couldn't tell if she was asking a question or offering a compliment. Either way, I nodded. "I do," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. Not for their sake, but for mine. The truth is, I didn't walk away from that dinner feeling triumphant or vindicated. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. And as much as I appreciated the shift in their tone, the change in how they saw me, it didn't change how I saw myself. Their recognition was a bonus, at best. A nice to have, but not a need to have. Because when I built my life, I built it for me. Still, that evening marked something I couldn't ignore. The family had to question everything they thought they knew. It wasn't just my success that challenged their assumptions. It was the realization that they had underestimated me in the first place. And the irony? My success wasn't in spite of them, it was because of them. Their doubt had shaped me, yes, but their absence had freed me to become someone they never expected. By the time I left that night, the tension had faded, but the shift stayed. My father said goodbye with something almost like hesitation, as if he didn't know how to approach me anymore. My mother hugged me longer than usual, and even my sister was unusually quiet. Whatever came next for us, one thing was clear: there was no going back. But this wasn't just about them. It was about me.
Success isn't just about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. For most of my life, I thought earning my family's approval would make my achievements feel real. I thought if I climbed high enough, if I made myself undeniable, they'd look at me the way they'd always looked at my sister, with admiration, with respect. But here's the truth. No amount of applause from someone who doubted you will ever heal the damage they caused. That healing only comes when you stop needing their validation in the first place. At first, their doubt was fuel. Every time my dad told me stability was the best I could hope for, every time my mom dismissed my efforts as a phase, it pushed me to work harder. I told myself I was going to prove them all wrong. I imagined the day they'd finally see me as someone important, someone worth talking about. It was a fantasy I clung to for a long time, but it was a heavy one to carry. Every project I took on, every late night spent trying to get ahead, wasn't just about succeeding. It was about waiting for them to notice. And they never did. I remember getting my first leadership position. It was supposed to be a big deal. I had worked for years to get there, taking on every extra task, working above my pay grade just to prove that I could handle it. When I finally got the promotion, the first thing I did was call my mom. "That's nice," she said, her voice light and distant, the way it always was when she didn't know how to connect. "Your sister just got an internship with the district attorney. Did I tell you?" Her words hit like a bucket of cold water, reminding me that no matter how far I went, they'd always find a way to redirect the focus back to her. That moment forced me to ask myself who my hard work was really for. Was it for me, or was I still trying to win a battle they didn't even know I was fighting? It was that realization that shifted everything. Studies show that relying on external validation often leads to emptiness when the people you're trying to impress don't respond the way you expect. And that was exactly it. My achievements always felt hollow because I wanted them to matter to people who didn't see their value. Once I caught on, everything began to change. I stopped telling them about my promotions after that, not out of anger, but because I realized it didn't matter what they thought. When I let go of the need to prove myself to them, I started focusing on what made me feel confident and fulfilled. Every late night at the office, every boost in responsibility,
stopped feeling like a craving for approval, and started becoming something else entirely. Pride. Not the kind of pride you have when someone claps for you, but the kind you carry quietly, knowing you've earned it. Intrinsic motivation was what made the difference. Research shows that people who are driven from within, not because of what others think, but because of their own goals, are more likely to feel fulfilled in the long run. It's such a simple idea, but I hadn't really grasped it until I felt the shift for myself. When I finally started working toward goals that mattered to me, and me alone, everything about my career became clearer. I wasn't just running toward success for applause anymore. I was doing it because I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed learning, solving new problems, and pushing myself to see how far I could go. And the funny part? That's when the biggest breakthroughs in my career happened. When I stopped caring what they thought. One example stands out more than most. A few years ago, I had a meeting with one of our highest-level clients. It was intimidating. These were people who had been in the industry longer than I'd been alive, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to lead a conversation with them. But something inside me had shifted by then. I wasn't walking into that room wondering if my parents or my sister would ever see what I was doing. I wasn't trying to impress anyone but the professionals sitting across from me. By the end of the meeting, not only did they sign on for a long-term contract, but they complimented the strategy I had developed directly. That felt real. It felt like success because it didn't hinge on anyone's approval but my own. The funny thing about letting go of external validation is how free it makes you feel. Every time I walked into a boardroom after that, I felt lighter. My work started reflecting it too. I was taking bigger risks, speaking up in a way I never had before. For years, I'd been so afraid of making noise because I didn't want to fall short of their expectations. Once I realized their expectations didn't define me, that fear went away. The results were undeniable. My confidence grew, and so did my career.
A turning point for me was reflecting on the quote I'd come across during that time. The best revenge is living the life they said you couldn't. At first, I hated it. Revenge? It felt bitter, petty, not at all the person I wanted to become. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood it had nothing to do with spite and everything to do with being whole. Living the life I wanted independent of their doubts meant taking back every moment their words had weighed on me. It meant showing myself I was capable, regardless of what they believed. My family's doubt didn't disappear overnight, even after I became successful. If anything, it lingered in subtle ways, in awkward comments at family gatherings, or moments when they still tried to downplay what I'd built. But what had changed was how I reacted. Those cutting remarks that once stuck to me like barbs didn't dig in anymore. Their opinions had stopped being the compass I used to navigate my worth. I had my own compass now, and the path it showed was mine alone. Eliza Matthews' story comes to mind when I think about this shift in focus. Like me, she spent years trying to win her father's approval, thinking it would make her success feel more complete. But that constant chase kept her from truly enjoying her accomplishments. It wasn't until she stopped needing his recognition that she found peace in the work itself, in knowing her efforts weren't for anyone else but herself. I saw so much of myself in that story, and it made me realize just how important it is to define success on your own terms. For years, my self-worth felt tied to how my family saw me, and that's one of the hardest parts of growing up in a dynamic like ours. When one sibling is favored and the other is always written off, you carry that imbalance with you into adulthood, at least until you decide not to. The thing is, their favoritism taught me something I might not have learned otherwise. It taught me how to stand alone. As painful as it was, those moments of being overlooked forced me to build an internal drive that could withstand anything.
And in the end, that's what carried me farther than I ever thought possible. I don't regret the years they doubted me. It shaped who I am, not as a person defined by their disbelief, but as someone who found strength in spite of it. The best revenge is living the life they said you couldn't. That line stuck with me, not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I wanted to prove myself right. And I did. Looking back now, I wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who push you the hardest. Their disbelief, their silence, it all shapes you in ways they'll never understand. But here's the truth. Their opinions aren't the measure of your worth. If you've ever been underestimated, let this be a reminder. Your success is yours to define. Build your life on your own terms, not for applause, but for the pride that lives quietly inside you. Who knows? One day, they might just stare in disbelief too. And when they do, you won't need their approval. You'll already have your own. If you enjoyed this sweet tale of triumph after struggle with my family, subscribe, like, and leave a comment on a time you felt doubted from your loved ones. If you enjoyed this sweet tale of triumph after struggle with my family, subscribe, like, and leave a comment on a time you felt doubted from your loved ones.